Hi there. So to introduce today, I'm interviewing for a new role right now. And that means I've been talking with lots of companies about the challenges they're having, especially around product design. And there are a few patterns that I keep seeing cropping up. And one that's really common is the people in these companies are desperate to improve the customer experience of their products, but they just don't have access to the information they need to make that happen. And one of the big things that happens is the customer experience is just much less salient to the people making decisions than the internal experience of the employees and the systems internally. One memorable quote somebody shared with me is that it's like the customers are behind a thick wall. We can hear muffled screaming on the other side, but we don't know if it's in pain or joy or what to do about it. And I think I've been in companies where they've tried to find ways to apply simplistic metrics to measure the customer experience. But every experience I've had with things like that has shown me they just don't really help show anyone what to do about anything. They're really lagging. They're almost immediately gained. I've also built continuous discovery habits at two companies, which is very much more qualitative and gets customer exposure for the teams. And it's been transformative, but also has problems. It requires an enormous amount of discipline to keep it up. And it's still susceptible to bias. And it's really hard to share that experience beyond the team to share it with the larger organization. So I'm sure there must be a better way. And that brings me to when I came across our guest today, Dave Snowden, at UX Brighton a few years back. And he came on after a day of pretty standard UX talks, all back to back, and then proceeded to systematically, but quite good-naturedly, shred all the talks to absolute ribbons by explaining many of the false premises that they were based on. One of the things I clocked that day was Dave's tool, SenseMaker, which looked to me immediately like it might help with some of the challenges I've mentioned here. And I'm delighted to have Dave join me today to talk about SenseMaker in the context of product design. So with that, Dave, would you like to introduce to the design world, I suppose, where does SenseMaker come from? What's different about it? And how did you come across it and come up with it?
And that Brighton conference was a lot of fun because my daughter was at university in Brighton, so I'd always like an excuse to get down there. So just for once, I sat through the whole of the conference. And it's always dangerous to let somebody like me listen to other speakers because we can't resist the temptation to change our slides as we go along. So I did a lot of that. I think there is some really interesting general problems in design at the moment, all right? And if you look at, and particularly in the context of, say, for example, Agile, where a lot of it is used, both Agile and the design thinking movement are very much at the end of their life cycles. And you can see that because of the extensive commodification of what they offer. Everything is certification schemes and templates and recipes. And if I see that goddamn double diamond again, I will go insane, right? They're essentially very linear processes. So there's an underlying assumption there that people know what they want. And if you can just find out what they want, you can deliver it. And that's the sort of linear manufacturing context. And you see this in IDEO's type stuff, and I'm never quite sure how to pronounce IDEO. Is it IDEO or IDEO, whatever it is, whatever, right? It's a linear process. So it's basically what we call the two key elements, ideation and also what they call ethnography, but they don't really mean ethnography. They mean a few observations and interviews. Real ethnography takes a lot longer. So the idea is you have some sort of discovery process, and then you have some sort of ideation process, and then magically a product comes out of that, which is all good. Yeah. So I'm not going to argue that that's not a good thing to do, but I'm going to argue it's very severely limited. And so over the last 2 to 3 years, we've been working with people from MIT, from Stanford, from other US and other institutions in a series of both events and work on a complex systems approach to design. And there are common elements with that, with the work we're doing on, for example, pre-Scrum techniques in Agile, because that's exactly the same issue. And there are two things which come out of that. I'll talk first of all about what is effectively a 2x2 matrix, then mention scaffolding. So if we look at, we got these two concepts. So we've got discovery, we've got ideation. What I want to do is to look at two aspects of that. And these are spectrums, not categories. One is experts and the other is distributed. So I can either have expert discovery or distributed discovery. I can have expert ideation or distributed ideation. Those are my two dimensions. So current design thinking, which isn't very well regarded in design schools in universities because they think it trivializes the process. You know, the idea you can do a 2-day course and somehow or other it magically replaces a 7 to 10 year training program. I mean, my cousin's son is an archaeologist, not an archaeologist, an architect. And he did 3 years at Cambridge University, got a first. He then did some practice. He then did 3 years at Harvard University, got a distinction, then did some more practice. And kind of like just around now, 10 or 15 years later, he's allowed to design buildings. He didn't go on a 2-day
I knew some architects at Cambridge as well, and they worked hard.
He didn't come out after 2 days with a certificate, all right, which is what people are doing. So if we look at that matrix, we can then look at two things. So one is, and SenseMaker comes into all of these, right? So one is distributed ethnography or distributed discovery. So that's where you want to discover the day-to-day issues and concerns that people have. Yeah. And the reason you want to discover those is that the pace of change of technology is faster than people know what to demand. This is a big mistake made in software development, is people don't know that you can do things for them. Yeah, so we call this, the other phrase for this is unarticulated need mapping. And we do that with SenseMaker by continuous journal keeping, or you get a sample of people in the population to act as journal keepers and or journalists. And we gather micro-narrative. And critically, and this is a big area, so I'll just mention it briefly, we focus on self-interpretation of micronarrative, not expert interpretation or algorithmic interpretation. And we do it to generate what's called high abstraction metadata. So for example, we'll present somebody with 6 triangles and the labels on all the triangles have positive qualities. So to give an example of distributed ethnography here, we did a big project for Philips Lighting in the Netherlands, and we were looking to understand people's experiences of their gardens because we wanted to see if we could create new products. People weren't asking for lights, but if we can understand better what they're trying to achieve, we might find uses for lights they haven't thought of. So we pulled in 3,000 micro-narratives over the course of a week. That was a social media campaign. It was €10 to a tree planting charity for every story that somebody told within the defined groups that we wanted. So it was actually really cheap market research. But we didn't ask people questions about light. What we did is we hid statements about light and darkness and shade in the triangles. So we weren't saying, do you want more light in your garden? We were seeing if light came up in the way that people interpreted their narrative. And in social systems design, we're doing the same on that, for example, on teenage suicide, where, let's take something more serious, all right? Where, things like obesity, things like bullying, things like social exclusion are all factors. If you ask kids about that, they'll tell you what they think you want to hear. We don't do that. We get people to diarize their experience. And we hide issues around obesity and bullying in the signification structure to see if they come out. Yeah. So what that allows us to do is to use a very large population very quickly. And because we got quant data, not qual, and the quant is coming in real time, we can look at patterns within those stories. And if we get a cluster of patterns, then we can give that to a designer and say, can you do anything to improve this? So that's distributed ideation, distributed ethnography, expert ideation. Yeah. Then the other way is kind of like we've defined a problem. So this is expert ethnography, but we know that out there are different ways of thinking. So this is, the famous thing, which I quoted at Brighton and I've quoted at many conferences since. If you give radiologists a batch of X-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla in plain sight, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, 83% of radiologists won't see it, even though their eyes scan it. So we do not see what we do not expect to see. So what we do is we get an expert definition of the problem, which can be presented as an infographic, a picture, a video, or text, or any combination. And we distribute that to a very large human sensor network. which is culturally, ethnically, experientially diverse. And we get them to signify what they see in it, to tell stories about what it means for them. And from that, we draw patterns. And that allows us to demonstrate dominant views, minority views, but also to find outlier groups, people who are seeing the problem differently. I call this finding the 70%. And interestingly, so in product design, that's quite powerful. You can use broad populations of designers and engineers, because engineers may not realize that they've created something which will work. You know, magnetos were designed for radar machines, not for microwave ovens, but they probably made more money for microwave oven providers. So it's that sort of lateral application. And also that has a wisdom of crowds aspect of it. So you've got a degree of objectivity in what is otherwise a really difficult world. If you want the academic language for this, this is abductive research rather than inductive research. You're trying to find novel or interesting patterns. So that's really powerful. And that means you can build various networks, and you can use that to isolate or focus where you should do development. So those are kind of like two aspects. And the final one
reminds me of, sorry, just switch that I have noticed that in the world of product design, sometimes it's a nice sort of trick. If you stumble across a user who solved the problem in some hacky way for themselves, then that gives you some clues as to how you might do it in a more general way. And that's sort of stumbling across those outliers, but there's not usually a good way to find them, systematically.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, one of the first big, and I used to be an accountant, and I codified all bunches of accounting systems, and then moved into decision support. And I still remember when the first big client I had, they told me what they wanted, and I was thinking, well, actually, that's not what you want. What you're doing is you're codifying what you currently do to try and reduce costs. So I just went away and coded what I thought they needed, and I got it right, which is why I got promoted, and the rest of the story goes from that. Because I mean, and I was fairly unique then. There weren't many of us who had a background in operational accounting who could also code. It was actually quite rare. And I would say one of the major issues that the software community has at the moment is that there are nobody left like that. So yeah, when I was working, we had 4 GLs and 3 GLs, so you could actually do things quite quickly. Then you handed it over to the C++ guys to actually improve the optimization, but you didn't let them in on primary design. I could design as I was coding, yeah, and we need some of that back. The fourth element, which is also fascinating, is where you basically combine the distributed ethnography with the distributed ideation. So again, if I come back to the Philips case, we gathered those stories from the gardens, but then we got Philips engineers to actually index all of their core technologies without knowing why. And then we matched the databases together. And we got 5 clusters, yeah. And all of a sudden people in marketing would then say, well, why is that technology being linked with that story? And in 3 cases, oh my God, we could do that. So that meant we had much more rapid advancement, and this is one of the big things in the EU Field Guide to Complexity Management, which came out last weekend. It's called exaptation or radical repurposing. You need to radically repurpose what you're already competent at for novel purpose rather than inventing from scratch. So that's the sort of 4th box. We call it exaptive innovation. So what that does is say, look, traditional design thinking is bottom left, exaptive innovation, which is really exciting, is top right. And there's some interesting things bottom right and top left as well, all of which make this a richer space. I think so for example, in software design, we have pre-agile processes. Yeah, and one of the ones I like best, and I'm adapting this now for strategy design, is called a mutated joint application design workshop. So you get a group of people together with some prototypers, and over 8 hours you build a prototype. You then hand over the prototype to a group on an 8-hour time zone from you. So you go, say, from London to Mumbai. You don't tell them what the original requirement was. You just give them the output and say, improve that. And then 8 hours later, they hand it on to somebody in Frisco who does the same thing, and then it comes back. And every time I've run that, users have looked and said, God, I wouldn't have thought of that. Can I please have it? Yeah. So when I'm breaking the linearity of the process. Yeah. The final thing on design, which is much more architectural, and this is where I'm going back to object orientation, which is not the same thing as microservices. Yeah. And I was arguing in Corba committees back in the 80s in the UK that actually people were objects too. And what we needed to do is to define people as identities, technologies, needs as objects, which could have inheritance, polymorphism, standardized input-output. And then we should allow them to interact so that solutions emerged. We shouldn't design the endpoint of a solution. What we should is design the components and their interactions and see what happens. And that was before I knew about complexity theory, which now gives me the science to justify what was then a common sense intuition.
Yeah, this is fascinating. That something that I've just stumbled across that's been emerging from, it's kind of a rebirth of the original information architecture world, but there's this idea of object-oriented UX, or something that's in a book that's just come out, which tries to define the objects and their relationships before getting to any sorts of screens or solutions, so that you can I think that scaffolding that you emerge.
Yeah, and we've been working on a whole typology of scaffolding. So we've got about 5 dyads now and about 15 different types of scaffolding. And the idea is that it's not just external scaffolding like you see on a building, right? You've also got internal scaffolding like the skeleton of a mammal. And then you've got behavioral scaffolding, which arises, say, in extreme sports over 10 or 15 years, but provides a sort of stable structure. So what we're now saying is, as a designer, you choose a scaffolding type, you do choose the objects, you define the interactions, and you sit back and see what happens. And the good things you stabilize and the bad things you disrupt. And I think in software that's critical, because applications should be emergent properties of interactions over time. The last thing you want is another ERP system. And a huge irony is, just when we realize that ERP doesn't work, Agile adopts SAFe, which is the methods equivalent of ERP. Overstructured over here. The old joke about the States in the Second World War in Britain. Oversexed, over-rich, and over here was you could look at it. So I think that's kind of like that's what we'll call an ecological approach to design. Which doesn't, and remember, this is I'm starting to rebrand this now as rewilding, because the whole rewilding movement in ecology is not a return to the wild, it's actually restoring balance in the wild. So there is a place for structured stuff, and there's a place for unstructured stuff, and there's a place for interact. Every formal garden needs a wild garden somewhere for genetic diversity, if you want to take a metaphor. So high level summary, that's kind of like what it's all about. And things like SenseMaker are key to that, because they allow you to move to real-time distributed decision support. And they don't ask people concrete questions, because then people will try and answer them the way they think they should answer them. They gather so we go from evaluation to description, and we go from precision to abstraction. And if you have descriptions with abstractions, you can see novel patterns that you would not see otherwise.
Cool. Yeah, this, as I said, when I heard about this was extraordinarily exciting. And this is coming from me, whose background is essentially in UX design, and particularly the research side of that. And so intimately familiar with how hard it is to get people to tell you the truth when you ask them the question directly.
You have to live it as well. I mean, I did a lot of the UX on the Helsinki air traffic management system, right? This is going way back in my career. But I actually spent, I think, 2 months, learning how to be an air traffic controller to do that. Because I reckon there was no way, unless you'd lived the experience, you could do it. And the same when I was working with Thames Water for IBM. I spent 3 weeks with water engineers digging holes in the road and dealing with stopcocks full of hypodermic syringes from druggies. And if you've ever had raw sewage be pumped backwards into kitchen sinks under high pressure, which I had to encounter twice, then you kind of learn the reality of control systems. And what was fascinating on that, we ended up with a manual control system, not a computer-based control system. Because record cards in a cafe could actually contain better abstractions than a database.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, and this is, it makes me think of method acting, your sort of method designing. Definitely sounds like an interesting approach. So one thing that I wanted to get onto was, I've tried to sell in SenseMaker to more than one place now, and I keep coming up against just resistance. And I think it's part of it is the classic thing. I think that it's not standard. It's not a commodity, so you can't just buy it and know that you're safe. But another thing that's come up is actually the boss from the company I've just left was saying it's just not simple to buy. It feels like it's a process, and that's more complicated to embed than a simple tool like NPS. So even though we know NPS is rubbish, it's easy to put it in, so we can do it. And there's so many competing things looking for our attention and our time and energy. How is this going to, he's just not clear. How would SenseMaker fit into our company? What would it make better for us? And what would the cost be in time and resources for us? How does the data collection work? And what do I actually see? So he's got all these questions, which mean that it's just too much of a risk, I think, for him. How have you brought it in?
You might want to pull one of us in to help you have the conversation, right? Because you do face that a lot.
Yeah.
I think there are several things. I mean, first of all, there is this problem that what people want is to buy something everybody else has bought. And just
get different results.
And hopefully they'll get different results. The reality is they won't, right? I think there are 2 or 3 things. One, the EU field guide is going to help considerably because that removes the risk for people. So SenseMaker is all the way through that. You want to learn the lessons in a crisis, this is how you do it. And we're helping that a bit because traditionally, I mean, I don't do this, but a lot of the people who work for me to some extent and others do it, is they like the design process. I prefer to design it and just give it them. So my view is, here's the package, go do it. And then after you've done it for 3 or 4 months, we'll talk about maybe designing something specific. So either way, I've lost patience on that. And the EU handbook, the stuff we're getting ready for next week with the full launch of the methods, is basically a series of pre-configured SenseMaker instances downloaded from the web, run them following a recipe, and then we'll talk about changing it later. So that's a response to what you said to make it a lot easier, right? I think the other thing is people tend to get evangelical about selling something like SenseMaker, and this irritates me even more. And they want to throw everything out which went before and put in something new, and that's not going to work, right? So, for example, we can completely replace employee satisfaction surveys, which, to be quite honest, a complete waste of time and money. But there's no point in getting rid of them because there's a whole industry around it. HR are invested in it. Nobody's going to take a risk. But we normally put SenseMaker in to explain what the survey is telling you, because everybody's got a problem with that. So we can gather stories from people around the survey. We can index the stories. We can do that on a real-time basis. And then after a year or so, you realize that you don't need that traditional survey anymore. Yeah. Or you might decide you need it because you need to benchmark yourself against industry and they haven't changed yet. But your real management decision is based on numbers plus stories, which is actually more accurate. And some of this is also maturity of the market. I mean, SenseMaker was developed in counterterrorism. Yeah. And that's our origin, weak signal detection. And it was also something I'm reminding people about, designed to create better training data sets for AI. Because 20 years ago, myself and John Poindexter were sitting on a conference platform in the Pentagon and basically saying, guys, you don't realize the danger of AI is the algorithms don't matter, it's the bloody training data sets. And now, of course, 20 years later, everybody's sort of picking up on that. So one thing SenseMaker was designed to do was to produce better training data sets in near real time. Yeah. And so those sort of things are starting to come in now. And I've done new things all my life. I just get bored, right? I'm an innovator. And you learn patience. You have to wait for the old thing to fail for the new thing to become easy to adopt.
That makes sense, I suppose. Yeah. So what I'm hearing from that is, well, we've got some sort of proof now, if proof were needed, from the EU field guide being launched, which is really exciting.
That's more endorsement. I mean, we've had proof for a long time, in terms of projects. And we're the de facto standard in some areas like the development community in sort of understanding complex problems, and extensively academic projects and other projects. So there's enough proof there. I think what the EU field guide does is it reduces the risk. So one of the reasons that people bought IBM back in the 90s isn't it was the best kit, it was bloody crap, right? I mean, a VAX cluster was a lot better than an AS400 on any reasonable day, and God help you when you went to their software. DEC Alpha was ahead of its time. The IBM PC was a primitive calculating machine, right?
I
But
had an Acorn Electron back in the day. That was a good machine.
nobody gets fired for buying IBM.
Yeah.
And nobody gets fired for implementing a McKinsey's report. The consultancies have taken that over. So you need to remove the fear for people to innovate. And the field guide helps on that because, well, I implemented what the EU field guide said on crisis management. You can't really be blamed for that if it goes wrong. Whereas if you say, oh, I went to this obscure little company that Tom recommended to me and we did it and it goes wrong, you're in deep shit.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that psychology is important for innovators to understand.
Oh, totally.
And
yeah.
to be honest, also, you remember we'd worked with the EU for 2 years before. They adopted Cynefin before that. So it was kind of like a logical progression. Yeah.
Yeah. Good, makes sense. No, that mindset I know very well. It's something Rory Sutherland talks about a lot. And I think Keynes talked about it back in the 30s. I don't know. But yeah, with that's great. And then the other thing that I'm hearing as a thing is we can sort of bring in SenseMaker. Now it's packaged up nicely. It's possible to bring in SenseMaker as kind of a safe experiment on the edge, rather than trying to replace the center of
work. And COVID helps in that. I mean, one of the things we're launching next week is an app-based version of the software, which you can just download and use to capture lessons learned during COVID as a journalist or a journal keeper. Now, that also contains in it signifiers which will give us early indication of mental health issues. So that's again something which will be a standard version. You don't have to go through design. And I've been saying that to my own people for some time, is signifier design, if you know how to do it, is like easy. If you've never done it before, it's very confusing. So even if you get good results, you don't want to go through that process again. So kind of like it's better to get people to the results faster and then teach them to design specifics.
Yep, that makes perfect sense to me. That reminds me of teaching dance. Let them have a good time first, and then we'll get into the detail of why you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, but it's also life cycle. I did a lot of work on this back in IBM days. In the early days, the people you sell to are the enthusiasts. They want to know how it does it, and they want to be involved. It's like car enthusiasts, all right? As far as I'm concerned, a car is something I get into. I press a button, and I love my Seat Artica, but it does most of the driving for me. I can drive up to the Lake District and not touch the accelerator, because if all I have to do is steer the bloody thing, because it manages the speed and the haptic feedback is wonderful. Other people seem to spend the whole weekend taking their cars apart and reconstructing them. And when you're doing something new, you've got the fanatics. And the key thing is to understand once they come to an end, you've got to switch styles. And the reason a lot of novelty doesn't get through is people keep selling to the early adopters. They don't realize they've changed. Yeah, and I think that's what we're focused on at the moment.
That's great. It's the classic crossing the chasm problem there, I'm hearing.
Well, that was my original work, is how do you sell on the other side of the chasm? Because you don't want to cross it. And I've done a lot of work. I mean, that was how we brought object orientation into our work in data sciences. We tagged it on to legacy system maintenance. So we put RADJAD, we set up the DSDM consortium, which was an early agile thing. And we did that with competitors. So that made the standard. We didn't try and make it proprietary. Yeah. And then we put object orientation as something we might be able to do with legacy system management. So I don't think we ever actually did it, but people thought we were different. So they bought our legacy system management and we got the new things in. And so we didn't have to take those through the adoption curve.
Got it. Cool. So then I think this has been absolutely fantastic and a wonderful introduction. And I want to respect your time because I know things are very busy with the field guide going live and the wiki that we've got people working on.
I'm really excited by that, by the way. We got 200 people volunteered. I mean, against considerable internal opposition, I put all of the methods into open source. And now 200 people are massing next week to get them fully documented around the field guide. And that's what you need. The future is about this. You can't protect IP. What matters is speed to use it. Yeah? And you can only do that in a broad network. So thanks to everybody who volunteered. Yeah, it's always nice when you prove right, all right? So I'm enjoying myself on that.
That's good. I'm really glad. It's a very exciting thing. So speaking of that, like speed to adopt, speed to get something done, what would you recommend? So say there's some keen product designer or user researcher who's watching this and they're keen to get hold of SenseMaker and give it a go. What's the next step they should take? What do they do?
If you have a look on, there's a new website going up next week, which is the Cynefin Center website. So we're formally splitting the not-for-profit from the for-profit business. Yeah, that's deliberate. That will contain a series of tools and other things that you can request download for. So one of the big things is how you manage out of a crisis, and one of those is hypothesis generation. So those sort of tools are going to be readily available, and there'll be a whole series of webinars starting the week after next, which will make the guide available and tell people what it's about and give them opportunities.
What perfect timing. Very good. Well, all I can, I think that perfectly wraps it up. So I'll include, we'll include links to all the resources you've mentioned in the when we share this. But yeah, all that remains to say thank you very, very much, Dave. This was a real pleasure.
Okay. See you guys.
Cheers.